catch. So no matter what is happening in this room at 3:15, he will leave. In fact, if he's saying something, he will stop in mid-sentence and leave. And if you're asking him a question, that has nothing to do with how he feels about your question. So particularly with that constraint in mind, although the rest of us might be staying a couple more minutes, I think we need to get started. I am Barbara Andolsen. I am in the Theology department at Fordham University, and I am merely the moderator. To my left is Sidney Callahan, who is identified with the Hastings Center, as well she should be, because she helped found it. She's also a licensed psychologist and author of numerous books. David is at Mercer University, and among the things David needs to be credited with is that you are looking at one of the very few recognized scholars in Christian ethics, Catholic, Protestant, who initiated discussion and writing on the question of torture a few years ago when there was a deafening silence on that question. And that is one of his many contributions to the field of Christian social ethics. And the farthest to my left is Cristina. Is Cristina Page, and she is affiliated with the Spence Chapin Adoption Access Network, which in itself is a very interesting venture, but she's really on this panel in part because she's been one of the pro-choice activists most involved over the last decade in common ground efforts. And she also wrote a book that I have been meaning to look for on Amazon called How the Pro-Choice Movement Saved America. So Sidney, they will each speak for approximately 10 minutes. Oh, and as far as we know, that's the only mic working.
So I feel like I'm way over here in the corner.
Yeah, I got it.
Oh, maybe I'm going to get captured here. Okay, so I can sit down. When you say those things, I just connected to the shirt. Let's see. Or the jacket. The jacket, anywhere. Can you hear me now? I think I better just hold it, you know? I can't figure out any place to put it that will work. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. I've had a wonderful time at this conference, and I know all of you also had your minds opened and hearts opened, and will go home being different kinds of people. Well, my focus in this, how to support women in their pregnancies, is more going to be focused on the psychosocial, because I'm a psychologist, and social cultural, but I want to recognize at the very beginning that the most important things we could do have already been shown in some of the last sessions, which is change the society to support women, support families. And in that, I was thinking, how can I say how shameful I think it is, and how horrible it is, how little support we give to women. And here came an article in the Times yesterday about a woman in France, a young physician who just had her fourth baby, who is now a month old. And what are the things they do for women in France? And she has a nursery school, always guaranteed health care, tax benefits, family allowance. She has education, health care. She's able to work as a physician and take her children to the nursery schools, a nursery school at her nursery place at her hospital. All of these amazing and wonderful things that would seem just a dream to us. Now the article says that, of course, in France it's still a male chauvinist culture, so there's still problems of gender equality, but still the sense that France has this family policy now. It also may be tainted because they want to keep up with Germany and have their reproduction for the common good rather than for women. You don't have the feeling women and children are first, but still, it's a wonderful thing. So what could be more wonderful to keep you in your pregnancy to continue is to have these economic supports. I will be able to take care of my child, I will be able to work, I will be able to get an education, and I will have a life that I would want my child and myself to be able to have. Now, I think the material is not alone, however, because we know that you could have all the material benefits in a culture and still not in society and still not have psychological and other kinds of social capital support or social support. They don't always go together. There's some poor societies that have much more support for women in the kind of social, psychological aspect. And we also know that ideas matter, individuals matter, and that's the way societies get changed. People have moral insights, people are interested in morality, religious ideals. These are the things that also produce change in institutions. So the individual and the way it is now and the way it ought to be are always in a relationship. We think of feminism, what a change that has made. We think of civil rights. These things started as ideals and moral standards of worth, so that is important. So we want to see what would we do in this society where we don't have these institutions. We don't have all of these things that they would have in France to support women and to continue. Her fourth child, she said, was unplanned, but she said, but it didn't really make much difference in my life because I have all of these supports to keep my children and to work and to do all these other things. So how can we here, without those kinds of public support, do we have to reinvent everything and do we have to try to fill in? And yes, we seem to have to do that. So how could we give support to women? Well, there are all things that are already in place, and we would want to encourage those, and I'm sure Cristina will tell us about those kinds of things. We wanted to provide individuals and their partners or families with information that they need about opportunities, the availability of volunteer help, even from shelters, or new adoption options, and new programs, which I don't even know if they have in France, whether they have doulas who will come and help women. Will you have any mentoring that you could do you could meet with people who have had similar situations and get strength from telling their stories. Always, we know in psychology that face-to-face groups are probably the most powerful way to give support or to influence. The power of AA, the power of other kinds of therapy. Groups are extremely important, and of course we have the family always, but sometimes the family is not supportive. So peer support is important, and media communications now exist. I'm sure there are many new ways to do this, of sharing experience and telling stories, discussions of media films and DVDs and all kinds of things that could, even on the internet, that could give women support. So I think that material support is extremely important. But what about the rest? What about the psycho-social cultural things that we need? And here I think is the problem of, or question really, or challenge, of communicating positive values in various and different ways. And we always, in every exchange, every conversation, we are going to be not net value neutral. We are always giving implicit messages to each other, emotional responses through your face, through your gesture. So the importance of these interactions and the first moments and so forth in counseling and therapy or any encounter are extremely important. And we do give positive ideals and concepts in the language that we choose. And we would want to think, what would these implicit kind of factors be that could support pregnancy, could give a positive attitude toward this pregnancy, toward child rearing and adoption. And I think we can openly identify them and say explicitly endorse them while giving others their equal voice. I don't think that we need to worry that if we have our values, we are somehow impinging on other people. I think we can advocate the dignity and value of all lives. And of course, as a pro-life, I think the pro-life movement is all about radical equality, giving dignity to all human life. So I think the sense of those that are most vulnerable are those that need to be given most attention. This is a preferential option for the poor, and who that might be, we could discuss, but the sense that the most in need need the most resources. So I think that one thing I think is often neglected is when discussing pregnancy, child rearing, and adoption, is a kind of new, broader framework and a new length and time frame. They should be positively considered. Childbirth and child rearing can be recognized as appreciated how important this is to the whole society. It isn't just a private lifestyle choice. This is reproducing our society, our whole community. And this is why women deserve support and need support. And it's a practical reason why we should be giving communal and support to this as a worthy kind of choice of our resources in a society. It's a common and a public concern, and women should feel the dignity of what they are doing. By the way, we are talking now already about a pregnancy that has happened. We're not doing the other difficult problems that we have faced in the other meetings. And one other thing which I can give total support to is women need to consider the longer time frame of their lives, which will extend far, far, far beyond their child-rearing years. We are older and getting older and older. We have middle years and aging. And older women are very much empowered by their children and by their grandchildren. They are enlivened, and they have interpersonal help. They have relationships with these children, these ties, with their adult offspring. And children require such incredible effort at the beginning of their lives and energy in their lives. But I think we need to remember that adult child friendship that people have in the later part of their lives. This genetic tie is one that is, or even a family adoption tie, the family tie is one that doesn't go away. Friends move, professional colleagues move, but this is one connection that is permanent. And it is very important to know that in this society, the virtue of filial piety is still operating. People take care of their older families and their parents. So I think that is something that's important. This is a brief period. It's like being in a war. I always said it's like being in a good war. Many people look back on their war experiences in certain ways, and I think it's because there was a certain intensity there, but that is not what is going to be the situation forever. Also, the deeper understanding of the power of individuals' moral standards of worth, conscience, my ideals, my idea of happiness is important. And here I would just say the last thing is I have been writing a book about happiness and doing a lot of research on happiness. And happiness turns out to be all about giving and connections and having relationships. And the more relationships, the more giving and nurturing you can have. And family seems to be one of those key things. I'll talk more about that if anybody is interested, because evolutionary psychology is showing all kinds of new things about positive joy, positive emotions. Last thing about adoption, I have an adopted grandchild. It made me think more about this. And one of the things here is new research by some of the anthropologists, Sarah Hardy, about mothering, and that the importance of alloparenting, the fact that the human species is a species that will share parenting in a group, whereas chimpanzees won't. So the sense of trust and the idea that many people can nurture children, how important that is. So I think that would be important to offset some of the problems of adoption that we have been hearing about. Why do people want to adopt? Because they want to give nurturing and be loving and have this happiness in their lives. So I don't think I've heard too much about happiness at this conference, but it's something that is extremely important when we start to think about. The testimonies of lives that we've heard have often been that, what love gave to them, but we don't talk about it enough, I think, when we're thinking about these problems. So I'll end here and we'll talk more.
You can stand up, right?
I'm not sure. I think you may be alone.
Okay, so I won't stand up either. Okay, all right. Well, thanks for being the tiny minority of people who decided to come to our session. And my understanding of the purpose of this session is to talk in a more nuts and bolts way about preventing unintended pregnancy and supporting pregnant women. And so what I decided to do was to take you to my world. I grew up in Northern Virginia, but I've spent most of my adult life in the South. Anybody who knows Virginia knows that Northern Virginia is not the South, okay? But I spent most of my adult life in the South. I'm a Baptist minister. I'm a seminary professor, college professor in various, mainly Christian institutions of higher learning. And I would like to kind of take you into that world a little bit. And also, speaking as a father of a 22-year-old girl who just got married and a 20-year-old son, an 18-year-old daughter, I want to talk about the values and the interaction of our family culture with the culture that we find ourselves in the United States right now. So I'll put on my reading glasses and read what I used to be able to read without reading glasses. All right. So I'm speaking from the perspective of this vast set of religious communities, often located in the South. Not only there, I'm talking about Baptists, I'm talking about evangelical Christians, millions and millions of Americans. What do we know about these families and the churches that these families are a part of? Generally, they do not accept the moral legitimacy of sex outside of marriage. They do not believe that sex outside of marriage is a wise thing to do. They devote considerable effort to teaching and inspiring and exhorting their young and unmarried folks to abstain from non-marital sex. And they fail a lot. But they succeed sometimes too. These efforts are a ubiquitous part of the subculture that many of my students have come from, and so they all have stories to tell about efforts that their families and their churches made to encourage abstinence before or outside of marriage, such as the True Love Waits program and other kinds of programs that have done their very best to encourage abstaining from intercourse outside of marriage. But culture and the structures of our society are working against the success of these efforts. As still in the culture that I come from, marriage is understood to be the context in which sex is supposed to happen. But marriage is increasingly delayed. 24, 26, 28, 30, 32 years old. And so the message of abstinence before marriage bumps up against social realities that are becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. And everybody recognizes this and is trying to deal with that. Meanwhile, these are often families that find it very difficult to figure out how to communicate with their children or their church members about birth control. They don't want to treat premarital sex as a live option, so they don't want to just openly equip their young people with the tools that might make such sexual activity more readily thinkable. But some of these young people, these teenagers and young adults, are having sex. So, because these families and churches don't feel comfortable saying, if you're going to have sex, use contraception, I think it's fair to say that conservative religion is one contributing factor to the remarkably high rate of unintended pregnancies in our culture. And that's just a fact. And there are numerous stories, anecdotes, as well as statistics about the number of devout evangelical Christians and Roman Catholics who end up in abortion clinics because they feel they have no other option and they were never given birth control information. That's just a fact also. We have to find a way within more conservative religious subcultures to deal with this human problem that causes such great suffering. I am an evangelical Christian, progressive evangelical Christian, Protestant. In my world, I sense currently a weakening of opposition to the provision of birth control and birth control information, including in the South. Opposition is beginning to weaken because of the problems that I have just named. And so I think we're in a moment now where you could get, at least in some school districts in Texas or Mississippi or Alabama, you could win the argument that even if one would wish that our young people were not having sex, we should tell them about birth control anyway, and that ought to be happening in the public schools. This does make Protestant context different from officially kind of traditional Catholic context in that there is an openness there. Still, there's a kind of, in most religiously conservative Protestant families, there's a kind of don't ask, don't tell thing going on that looks something like this. We won't tell you about birth control, say the parents. You won't ask us for birth control. But neither will we ask you to tell us if you're figuring out how to get birth control for the sex that we wish you weren't having. Okay, so it's all in there together. Don't ask, don't tell, nobody's talking. And we're just hoping we don't have the conversation, Dad, I'm pregnant. Okay, that's our reality. It's a highly unstable and unsatisfactory arrangement, but I think we are gradually seeing a weakening of the wall of resistance to the provision of birth control information, at least in the public schools. I would say, though, that we can't underestimate the significance of private Christian schools and homeschools in which there's not a way in the world that birth control information will be discussed. Ever. Not in my world, anyway. And so that the problem then is a little different there. I do think that with concerted effort and appeals to data, common sense, and compassion for teenagers and young people, that at least in the evangelical Protestant world, we can see a softening of resistance to contraception and provision of contraceptives. The morality of contraception is not the intrinsic problem in Protestant thought that it is in traditional Catholic moral thought. I think that opposition to contraception on the Protestant side has been driven by a broader set of fears about the direction of the culture and fears for the emotional and moral well-being of children and teenagers. Also, the awareness that contraception sometimes fails. All of this is to say that it ought to be possible to work in historically conservative evangelical subcultures to increase the acceptance of contraceptive education and provision, at least as a second best option. I think it might even be possible to get evangelical Protestants on board to support the idea that birth control should be available for free to anyone who wants it as an aspect of preventive health care. I think that many evangelicals can be brought around to the idea that even if abstinence before marriage is preferable, the one thing worse than sex outside of marriage is unwanted pregnancy, and the one thing worse than that is abortion. And because many, many evangelical Protestants think this way, I think that they may be able to be brought around to supporting contraception. But let's speak about unwanted pregnancy for a moment. I'm thinking of this couple when I was teaching out in West Tennessee. This couple, he was a youth minister already. He was 19 years old. And she was, youth minister's girlfriend, and sophomores. And they gave in to their desires and went to a hotel and had sex. And 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, I forget when, they were panicky. They were at my door saying, we think, we may have just ruined our lives. And this kind of thing happens. In this case, as I recall, there was not a pregnancy, but because this couple was so passionate for each other and believed that sex belonged in marriage, they went ahead and got married while in college, and they ended up divorced, which happens fairly frequently in that subculture too. In the South, we still believe in marriage, but we just believe in it again and again and again. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so you have a situation where you're in a conservative Protestant subculture, and the young woman ends up pregnant. Probably a lot of us from that world are aware of tragic situations in which these young women felt forced toward abortion, not really as an aspect of agency at all, but due to a sense of social stigma or rejection from their families and religious communities. That it would be unthinkable for them to go back to mom and dad or pastor and say, I'm pregnant. But I can also tell you that change is happening at this level too. I have witnessed several quite conservative congregations rise to the challenge of providing full and comprehensive support of unmarried, pregnant teenagers and college students. I was looking at the Guttmacher statistics. 57% of abortions are for women in their 20s right now. So it's not a teen pregnancy issue anymore. It's broader than that. Okay, a lot of these are college students. So how does the church do this? It involves the ability to make a quick shift from just say no to we will love you unconditionally, and we will love the child you are carrying, and you will be welcomed and not excluded throughout the course of this pregnancy, and we will honor you for your decision to find a way to deal with this crisis without choosing abortion, and we will be with you in that process. I've participated in several congregations and parachurch organizations that have developed the skills and ethos necessary to nurture and care for both mother and child, and father, if the father's in the picture, through the course of pregnancy, and to provide non-coercive, loving care, enabling good decision-making. This is the church at its best, walking the journey with the suffering one, and just being there with friendship, support, and help. I remember one time being in a hospital room with a young lady who had gotten pregnant and had the baby and was in the process of giving the child up for adoption just after having had the child. And how hard that was, what grief there was involved with that, what suffering. She knew that it was the right thing for her to do, but she needed a community around her to pray her through that and talk her through that and be there for her and cry with her and so on. And churches are developing more of an ability to do that. Less judgmental, more supportive. And that, I think, is part of the answer that we need. One last paragraph. I focused my comments on the micro level, the relational level, the subcultural level. There are policy level matters that need to be addressed, all kinds of policy wonk stuff that maybe Cristina will solve for us. I am totally aware that all of these micro level experiences and challenges take place in broader economic, social, and political contexts. A country with a 10% unemployment rate, a miserably low minimum wage, an inadequate social safety net can be counted on to produce a large number of abortions for economic reasons. You can count on it. This ought to be taken seriously by all of our supposedly pro-life tax cutters and social service shredders. Also, a country with such fragile relationships between men and women, with so much instability, divorce, and abuse, can be counted on to produce a large number of abortions, as women do not want to risk destroying fragile relationships or raising a child alone. The more humane our economy, the more covenantal our sexual and romantic and marital relationships, the fewer our abortions. I support the most creative and effective policy measures available to deal with providing support for continuing pregnancy, while believing that the heart of the matter rests in our families, our churches, our culture, and our economic life.
So it's a good segue. I fear that what I'm about to say might alienate interns. Does that work? No? Yeah.
I hear you.
Okay, good.
But you're next to me, so I will hear you. So what does that mean? I don't know.
So I fear that I might alienate half the room, and I was speaking with Eyal at lunch, who knows how conflict resolution works, and he suggested I preface my comments by saying I will be pushing you. This is for the pro-lifers in the room, and I welcome being pushed back. I don't say any of these things to alienate you, but I also don't believe that common ground needs to be said only in soothing ways, or it means that we just need to be nice to each other. And so this is my book, How the Pro-Choice Movement Saved America, is not really a place where you'd think you'd go to find common ground ideas, but when I was working with my publisher, I asked them, I said, I want the subtitle to be a book for pro-life people. And they were like, no. But it was, and it remains intended for pro-life Americans. And this is what I'm about to read I'm sorry, I will probably be reading most of it, is a sample of the sort of thing I think that the pro-choice movement wants to say to pro-life America, and might be a good launching point for a needed conversation to start us on a real common ground journey. So it's called Pro-Life Pretense, and it begins with President Obama's still-to-be-released common ground agenda in the abortion conflict is already having a profound and largely overlooked effect. It has exposed deep fault lines in the pro-life movement. Obama's focus on reducing the need for abortion has been embraced by some practical-minded pro-lifers who are tired of decades of intransigence and who also appear jaded by the counterproductive culture of life sloganeering of President Bush. Pro-choice Bill Clinton presided over the most dramatic decline in abortion rates in the history of our country, after all. Pro-lifers Reagan, Bush 1, and Bush 2 did not. For an emerging movement of reasoned, results-oriented, non-ideological pro-lifers, results count. If a pro-choice president produces pro-life outcomes, they ask, are they any less worthy? For the traditional pro-life establishment, however, they are. In fact, to them, Obama's common ground call is perceived as a threat. Since Obama takes them, their beliefs, and their proposals seriously, they have been forced to justify some fundamental hypocrisies, the kind that have in the past led to rhetorical victories and little progress unless you count fundraising. Consider, for example, the clash between pro-life rhetoric and reality when it comes to crisis pregnancy centers, a much cherished initiative of the old guard pro-lifer. A recent report, A Passion to Serve, A Vision for Life, released by the Family Research Council, is a valentine to the nation's 3,000 crisis pregnancy centers. It commends them for communicating to women and their families, this is a quote, that their lives are valuable and that their needs, emotional, psychological, medical, spiritual, and practical, can and will be met. The report details the intense efforts CPCs undertake to persuade women to not choose abortion. The main message broadcast to those coming to a center is, support is available. You do not need to discontinue this pregnancy for financial reasons. But beside the ultrasound image women are provided, the most persuasive arguments available to CPCs, as any staff or volunteer will readily admit, is that women facing crisis pregnancies can make it work by depending on a network of publicly funded social services. For the vast majority of women convinced to become mothers, CPCs are a gateway to the welfare system. Theoretically, a pro-life common ground approach then would be to take seriously the benefits of CPCs as essentially referral agencies to services which can support women who really do want to keep a pregnancy. And also to say, let's make sure the right social services are in place that those women really need and that they are well funded. And here's where the old guard rhetoric runs into the brick wall of common ground and fact-based reality. The Family Research Council Valentine to Crisis Pregnancy Center may sound pretty and even compelling, but on closer examination is it sincere? In effect, groups like the Family Research Council, as well as most pro-life politicians, have been two-timing their devoted pregnancy center partners. While professing their love for their work, they batter the social programs on which the Crisis Pregnancy Center movement places its trust. The Family Research Council carefully details in its report the many federal and state-sponsored programs to which CPCs direct women, including Head Start, Medicaid, local health departments, legal aid, state children, SCHIP, state health departments, women's, infant, and children, and the Department of Job and Family Services. Yet when it's suggested that support for these very agencies should merit pro-life support, the Family Research Council lines up in opposition. Michael New, a senior fellow at the Family Research Council, recently launched an attack on the progressive pro-common ground pro-life group, Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good, for suggesting just that. The group conducted a study linking states that provide more generous services to the poor with lower abortion rates. It suggested that to reduce abortion rates, pro-lifers should consider the policies traditionally championed by Democrats, extended publicly funded social services to poor pregnant women, rather than exclusively focus on restricting abortion. But suddenly, the programs that are so effective when used as resources by crisis pregnancy centers are suspect. Michael New writes, "The study's questionable methodology and inconsistent results should give pro-lifers serious pause before they enthusiastically embrace higher welfare benefits as a strategy to reduce abortion. Furthermore, there is little peer-reviewed research which indicates that more generous welfare benefits have a significant impact. Other studies find that welfare benefits only have a marginal impact on abortion rates." New himself didn't miss the chance to praise the work of crisis pregnancy centers. He weighed in when the Family Research Council report came out, writing, "CPCs have offered real alternatives to literally millions of women facing crisis pregnancies. Countless women regret their abortions. However, the testimonials in the Family Research Council's latest report are evidence of the positive impact of the life-affirming options offered by many pregnancy resource centers." Of course, the life-affirming options are now no more than a euphemism for the welfare which, according to New, has a marginal impact on abortion rates. New's attack on the Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good policy proposal is a reflection of all-consuming hypocrisy plaguing an ideologically entrenched pro-life establishment. Crisis pregnancy centers rely on the welfare system to support the women they persuade to become mothers, while pro-life groups and politicians actively undermine the very programs and agencies that are the only resources available to support many women who want to have a child, as CPCs know. In 2007, the Children's Defense Fund published its congressional scorecard on the best and worst legislators for children. The organization scored Congress members' votes on many of the policies that help pregnant women decide whether to parent or abort. The votes were on Head Start, increasing the minimum wage, reauthorizing and increasing funding for SCHIP, increasing funding for children with disabilities, job training, Medicaid funding, helping youth pay for college, and tax relief for low-income families with children. Based on their votes on these issues, the Children's Defense Fund ranked 143 Congress members as the worst for children. Of the 143 worst legislators, 100% are pro-life. The long-established and long-dominant pro-life complex speaks out of both sides of its mouth, praising crisis pregnancy centers and yet disparaging the social services upon which they rely. In the upcoming months, the Obama administration will be revealing its Common Ground agenda, and one part of it promises to be supports for pregnant women. It is just the sort of agenda designed to appeal to a nascent, pragmatic, and moderate pro-life movement. Let's hope this rising voice of reason can lead the crisis pregnancy center movement to support an administration plan to help struggling families and indigent pregnant women. Praise for CPCs can't come packaged with attacks on the very supports they rely on. It not only defeats common ground, it defeats reason. Joseph Scheidler, president of the Pro-Life Action League, wrote an op-ed in USA Today claiming pro-lifers who embark on the search for common ground betray the pro-life cause, and in making his case, reveals the classic characteristics of this pro-life schizophrenia. He writes, "There is no evidence that increasing social programs such as low-cost health care and daycare, college grants, and maternity homes will impact a woman's abortion decision. It is rare in our experience to find a woman who says the reason she is choosing abortion is that she doesn't have daycare or that she'd rather go to college. More than 3,000 crisis pregnancy centers in the U.S. are ready to help a woman with material needs, emotional support, counseling, and medical care. Anyone who wants to stop abortion should promote these centers." Once we begin to till the soil of common ground, these contradictions and inconsistencies will become clearer. It is then that pragmatic pro-lifers may realize that there will be unlikely partners along the path to genuine pro-life victories.
I think in the interest of making the best of our time and not contributing to making the day longer and longer and longer, we should maybe move to audience questions, and I'm going to propose maybe 2 at a time.
Yeah, because otherwise they weren't getting answered.
Yeah. And please keep your question direct.
So I actually have a question for Dr. Gushee, in light of what you said yesterday especially. So I'd like to touch on the notion of tragedy and how it relates to what we're talking about today. I know you mentioned the idea of a woman who's giving up a child for abortion, for adoption, and how she needs support from the church and her society. Now my question is focusing on that child that is being given up for adoption, because that's also a tragedy for the child. So in light of Catholic social teaching and the Christian tradition, when we say that it is morally required for a woman to carry a pregnancy to term, even if that's going to represent a tragedy for herself and for that child, what is morally required of the rest of society or the rest of the Christians in relation to, does that make adoption morally required, albeit not legally required?
Maybe we should just do one at a time.
Yeah, why not?
Because that's such a great question.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose it. I think that there's a grand biblical tradition emphasizing the good of adoption, the theological move that basically all Christians are children of God by adoption. The way that Jesus seemed to relativize biological family and who is my family,
Well, he was adopted.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at the birth narratives in that way, Joseph would have adopted Jesus, right?
This is my son.
Right. So, yeah. So, I would say that a child that is given up for adoption, obviously there's a fragility and a vulnerability there. You don't know what's going to eventually happen with that child. I don't think that in itself feels tragic. It feels like a gift that somebody is giving that child to give them a family and a chance to get started, to have a shot at life. I know that there is a growing trend among young Christians that I teach, both at seminary and college level. More and more of these young couples or individuals who, looking at being married, are seriously considering adoption. I would, as a moral expression of their faith. There is, I don't know exactly how or why it's spreading. It may be partly a response to all the kinds of issues we've been talking about here. But I don't think it would be an overstatement to say that 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 8 of the young couples that I have counseled with or done premarital counseling with or have known will seriously consider or may well involve themselves in adoption, adopt a child. So I think that number is rising, and I would strongly encourage it. I don't think it's morally obligatory, but I think it is morally to be considered.
I hear often people say, well, how do I have my own child? Why should I have my own child when there's so many children out there that need to be adopted? So I think it really is a movement at this time.
Well, I mean, one of the projects I work on is the Adoption Access Network, which is a sort of a pro-choice effort to get adoption considered more of a reproductive right. And I think part of it is that we as a country don't understand what adoption is today. I mean, openness is now the standard, and so this idea that a woman would say, well, I could never bring a child to term and give it away for adoption and never know what's going on with it, or, well, that's actually not the norm today. What it's, you choose the family, you stay in touch, you decide the degree of openness, and so that makes it a lot more palatable for a woman to consider. But we need to look within adoption and say, what are the barriers for women? How do we make this an option that's accessible to a woman? So we're evening the playing field as to what all of her options are, making parenting more possible, making abortion available, this is from my point of view, and making adoption a real option. So, but one other thing I think as a kind of measure of truce, you mentioned about the grief that birth mothers feel, even when there is openness, and that's true. I mean, in some ways I think that it could be considered by many exponentially more difficult than abortion. But what we have is the price, the movement in the pro-life movement to say, well, women feel grief after abortion, and so therefore that's a bad decision. And so by the same standard, we would say, well, then adoption's a really bad decision. And so I think that we, as the two movements, should call at least a truce on using the emotional warfare to decide which is a decision that's these are all difficult decisions often, and so parenting as well. And so we should really, I think, have a truce on using that as a measure of what is right.
I think we should also stop thinking that joy and happiness can't include moments of suffering. These are really two different systems, and you can feel happiness and joy at the same time that you feel empathetic sorrow. And I think that's an extremely important thing, is to remember that life has both of these and they can be felt at the same time, so that your decision can be made on an overall, what is the best for this child and for myself at this time.
I'm Rachel McNair with Consistent Life, which is this on?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the peace movement pro-lifers. And I've heard a couple of times people express frustration over the political situation and the politicians. And Cristina, I think you just did an excellent exposition as to why. I mean, you just laid it out all very clearly, and I just want to say, as we Quakers put it, you spoke my mind.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I also have to make differentiate between really what I think is the establishment and groups like Consistent Life and
me too. The Alliance for Catholics. I mean, one of those people that are being
and David's work. Oftentimes it can seem as if we're generalizing, and I think that there are to be generalities made about the monolithic establishment. But there is what I see now, and which is so encouraging, and sometimes I feel like I shouldn't have this encouragement because it's like maybe it's not real, but that these pro-life groups that there is emerging a progressive pro-life movement that believes that there are other ways to consider approaching this issue, and so I want to acknowledge that view.
And they've always been there.
I would like to.
You need to give you a bigger bullhorn.
I would like to totally affirm your critique of, and you heard it in my talk too, the establishment basically politically conservative pro-life movement that somehow joins together absolutism on the abortion issue and total lack of concern, or in fact negativism about all social spending. I think that was the product of a political compromise at the origins of the religious right that brought together the whole libertarian tax cutter thing together with neoconservatism on foreign policy, together with social conservatism on cultural issues. And it is a ramshackle political coalition that won victories, and that's why it exists. But when it comes to making any sense whatsoever related to the actual well-being of women and children, it doesn't.
Right, and I dream of a political campaign that would take, all of those who wear the pro-life badge and say, weight based on what? If we were to say to Christine O'Donnell, based on what? To Sarah Palin, based on what? What are your pro-life credentials other than being endorsed by an organization that claims to be pro-life? We want to see in policy what you've done that really made, we want pro-life results. And how do you prove that? I think that the standard needs to be raised in the political spectrum as to who gets to call
That's
themselves
enough.
what.
Just say that again. Standards need to be raised in the political spectrum.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Brown. I'm a lawyer from New York. And one thing I just feel compelled to say, because you talked about crisis pregnancy centers, which is that I had the opportunity to learn a lot about what goes inside crisis pregnancy centers. And a great deal of it is true that the support that's offered is really welfare. But the other thing is that the primary tactic of the ones that I was privy to is to terrify women by making them feel that their health will be irrevocably compromised if they have an abortion, and it's done on the basis of lies. So I just needed to say that because I think they are very problematic in their techniques of lying to women about the health consequences of abortion. But as far as the question goes, I guess I want to push back some on adoption. I've always thought that adoption was an awfully easy panacea, the adoption, not abortion bumper stickers. And maybe I'm just not up enough on the current realities of adoption. But there's a terrific book written. I hope everyone who promotes adoption reads it, even if it reflects a different time than today. I still think it has a lot to offer, called The Girls Who Went Away. Are you familiar with that? So it's a book about the experiences of 100 non-randomly chosen women who gave up children for adoption in the pre-Roe years. And also a figure I came across in the course of writing a brief about abortion, that the numbers are very, very small of women who elect to give up their children. I thought it was 1%. That almost seemed too small to be possible. So it's 1%. And this statistic I found in a meta-analysis of studies of adoption was that the grief felt by women who'd given up children for adoption was actually greater than the grief of women who've had a born child die. So, these are very deep things to consider, and I guess I wonder how much are those things considered, or do you think that's all passé because there's openness now?
Well, one, I think that there's a lot of the research out there is very dated on adoption, and that's a problem. But I think that also the current adoption best practice is very much informed by the experiences of the women, who went away, the girls who went away. And now what we have is, what's so interesting to me, I recently did a presentation at PPFA about adoption, and I started off by saying, well, abortion rights actually, not intentionally, unintentionally created birth mother rights. Because what we saw was that in desperate need to get children who were, plentiful in the days before Roe, families would do anything. And so suddenly the birth mother was like, well, I want to see the baby again. I want to stay in touch. I want to know what's going on. And now what we have is really women, birth mothers in the driver's seat. And I think that we should be putting more fuel in that car. We need to address a lot of the problems that exist in adoption, and I think that bringing a pro-choice sensibility to it, it just blows out the walls. But, yes, I think that adoption is a very, very painful choice. I think it remains a painful choice for a lot of women, even with a very large degree of openness in the situation. But yet, that I think is a challenge for us to say, well, what can we do to make all of these reproductive choices more available to women? I don't think that it's a sort of, no trespassing sign.
And research being done now?
There's very little research being done on adoption, and partially because of its, it's 1%, that it's such a small constituency of the American public who's, dealing with it. But I do think that there is also, it's pervading the culture in a way through like Teen Mom, this MTV show. I think that we're seeing more examples of adoption, and what it is today. That's kind of, most people are stuck in the 50s as to what they view what adoption is. So I think we're getting a more modern view of adoption, and that may in fact make it a more palatable choice for women.
If I can exercise the prerogative of a moderator to jump in occasionally, I also think we need to remember, and I'm sure Cristina would join me in this, women who are having healthy white babies are in the driver's seat, but mixed race children, children of color, children born with disabilities, talking about legal cases. I remember one horrible surrogate mother arrangement that went wrong because the child was born with some sort of disability, and suddenly both sides were saying, I don't want it. We were paying for a healthy baby. We don't want this one that isn't normal. And on the other side, well, I was never intending to keep and nurture this child. I did this understanding I was giving it up. So you had people...
You see, there are about 500,000 families in the United States waiting to adopt, and each year there are about 17,000 children, 14 to 17,000 babies, infant adoption that comes up. And so whenever I've asked the adoption experts that I work with whether or not, children with disabilities, there's like, if they have trouble, placing these babies, it's like a spit take. No, there's no trouble. Are you kidding? We have whole registries of people waiting to adopt children with Downs. We have whole registries of children, with cerebral palsy. There's such a demand out there. And so I think that there's a difference between what's happening in infant adoption and there's what's happening in the foster care adoption world. I think that they're very different things.
Well, and I do think another issue, very complex, is out-of-race adoption in what is still a racist culture. And whether that effectively meets all the needs of a child, and at a minimum, the adoptive parents have to be, in my opinion, and I know of one couple like this, incredibly sensitive about the realities of racism so that as their child grows, they're capable of helping that child deal with racist experiences.
But this is also about openness. And so when you have a birth mother who is deciding where the child goes, oftentimes when we work with pro-choice adoption agencies, and the principle there is, well, this is, what are her choices available to her? So we need, as an agency, to make sure that there's a diversity of families available to her. If she's Latina, if she's African American, that there are those families. So there's a lot of cultivation that goes on in those communities. But if we're talking like from a pro-choice standpoint about adoption, well, a lot of pro-life agencies automatically off the bat limit the pool of families that are available to her, either by not accepting gay or lesbian families, not accepting single parents. Well, that's an anti-choice moment for, I think, within adoption. That should be her choice. as to who she places the child with, and she should have that range. But yes, and so I think that there's a lot, these are values, these are value calls, and I think that there's a wide range of what's happening within the adoption world about closed adoption, open adoption, and these very values that I think people look at adoption and see a one-dimensional view, but in fact, there's a lot of different values at work in different places, and that's part of our work, is to kind of set a pro-choice standard in that field.
Yes, Laura Chasen with the Public Conversations Project. David, you said something that gave me an idea. I'm wondering whether there isn't the possibility of a trans-spectrum coalition among people at this conference to act to prevent the reduction of supports for children and babies and mothers when this cost-cutting that is probably lies ahead starts. I'm just wondering, kind of a preventative effort. It's not great now. We probably aren't going to get a whole lot more, but could we agree that reducing what there is something we would be willing to join together to work to prevent? So that was just I sort of wanted to share that idea and see what your reactions were.
It's a fascinating idea. Let's say we end up with a political climate where there's an effort to cut, discretionary domestic spending by 25% or something. I would think that 98% of the people in this conference would oppose that when it came to a lot of things, but especially the well-being of mothers and children and the programs associated with them. It would be a great outcome of this conference to have a coalition across that spectrum of people who are represented on this program and in this audience. I think that would be great. We should, the conference organizers should hear about this idea.
And then have emails so they know our email.
And
I know two of them.
So I think that's a great idea, and it would reflect the best spirit of this meeting.
We need a brick and mortar meeting at the end of this to say, well, what can we do together? And it's a perfect suggestion.
Hello, my name is Sarah Richards, and I'm from Students for Life of North Carolina. But what's more is I am the sister of two adopted brothers, and they are absolutely wonderful, neither of which are white, and which is what I wanted to ask you about. My brothers both have the same birth mother, and before she chose adoption, she had 2 abortions previously. Now, when she had those abortions, she was supported by her friends and by several of her family members, but when she decided to choose adoption, she was chastised. People questioned, why in the world, how could you give up your children? And she felt that she had a much larger support group when she chose abortion rather than adoption. And I was wondering, on both pro-life and pro-choice standpoint, how we can help lift that social stigma of adoption versus abortion, and also what can be done in order to make that a more realistic option, because as a family that's adopted twice, it is very difficult to choose adoption at times, both emotionally and practically. So it's one thing I'm very curious about. Thank you.
Such a great question. The way I got into this work was I did an initiative at the New York City Public Hospitals which standardized abortion training for doctors throughout that network. And I was approached by Spence, Chapin, which is a pro-choice agency, that said, we're actually facing a lot of similar problems about adoption. And so they started to talk to me about this kind of system-wide stigma that their birth moms were confronting on delivery. And so things that we would have rallies out front of if we had heard of, middle of the night prayer vigils over their beds to convince them not to have to give a baby up for adoption. One woman was a victim of incest. The nursing staff had no idea what the context of her pregnancy was, and one nurse came in and said, this baby will never forgive you for the rest of your life for giving it up. You should reconsider. On the other hand, we have nurses that think that because a woman has an adoption plan, that that's some form of neglect, and that they try to protect the baby from the mother by violating her parental rights, which she hasn't surrendered, not letting her see the baby, not letting her hold the baby. Just, unbelievable violations that we came and said, don't thank us now, New York City Public Hospitals, because we're going to say this quietly. But you need to address this, otherwise, there's going to be legal action. So there is a huge stigma against adoption. It's the right choice. It's presented as the right choice, right? Politically, you have Giuliani on the campaign trail bragging about adoption rates skyrocketing under his, no matter wasn't true. But the implication there being that this is the we're going to reduce abortion by increasing adoption is not really a correlation. It's not women don't really choose that. Most women's place for adoption today came for an abortion and came too late. That's what the statistics show. So these are not necessarily pro-life women. But I think the Guttmacher Institute did a study this last year about why women choose abortion. And what the researcher wrote in her write-up of the study was that unsolicited, several women had come to, they were not asked about adoption, but several had come and said, the reason why I'm not choosing adoption is that I could never, give up my baby and not know where it was and not know how it was doing and all this. Period. No more said. No one ever offered to her in that instance broke that misconception about what adoption is. And so from just the vantage point of what information women have available to them to make the decision that's best for them, we have to make sure that we can't assume that she knows everything about adoption and discounted it. The fact is that there's widespread misunderstanding about what adoption is, and it's incumbent upon us to say, this is a very important decision that you're making with your life. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to tell you all the information that you need to know about all your choices, because that's my role in life, is to make sure you have all these choices available to you. So bear with me. Here we go. Get it out of the way, and then let her be the one that makes the decision that's best for her. But I think that we do, especially I see it from the pro-choice vantage point, that we need to own adoption as much as we own prevention, as much as we own abortion, because we're not pro-choice otherwise. So that's what I think. But the stigma is not understood, and it's real, and we fight against it in the pro-choice movement about abortion, and we should commit ourselves to doing it with adoption as well.
Yes, I've been booed by even mentioning adoption. Just say, well, and then there is adoption. If you're talking to a sort of an old line pro-choice group, you could be booed for that.
I don't get that at all.
Now it's different.
In my subculture, adoption is a choice that would be honored. Great choice, heroic choice. I could see by the bedside there might be family members maybe who would be regretful, maybe, but.
I think it depends on how strong in the culture a sort of genetic relationship is
The MTV show Teen Mom, one couple whose teens placed for adoption, and their mother, the mother of the girl, is so abusive, so consistently reminding her of the choice that she made was wrong, and that she deprived this mother of a grandchild, and she just is just demonic in the show, and you can see the will that this girl has, is that she says to her mother, every time you say that, I decide I made the right choice, I don't want the baby in this atmosphere, and she encouraged her kind of stamina against this, and it's an amazing show, and they've done more to bring a face to adoption than anyone. But I think that there's a lot of complicated emotions about adoption. I don't think that this mother would be as abusive if her daughter terminated the pregnancy.
Well, I do think I myself had that concept. One of my pro-life ideas was that this is my own kin, my relation, my child is related to my father, mother, my brothers and sisters and so forth. But then I thought, well, how could I do that with my other idea that we're all related? So I think the idea of thinking of your whole
the human species and relations also. That was one way it helped me. And then I read about this allo parenting, and I think that helped me too. You know, it isn't just a one-on-one relationship with mother and child. It's a lot more going on to raise a child.
Hi, my name is David. I'm a healthcare provider in upstate New York and just a concerned citizen. I want to point out what I think is an apparent contradiction, and then that's going to lead me to a question. So it seems to me that there's an expectation that women should have the right to choose an abortion because, perhaps for, reproductive choice, let's just say it that way. And yet there's not an opportunity for people to choose fiscal choice, right? And so there may be a group of people who don't want to support maybe the financial obligations that would come along with some of the programs that you guys are talking about, but people in the society don't have the opportunity to withdraw and make a financial choice, so they don't want to participate with that. And so the expectation is that women should have the right to have a reproductive choice, but then people can't elect to have a financial choice and withdraw from the system. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, that kind of so based on like taxes being removed, so you don't support a choice that is morally reprehensible. So I don't know. I mean, you say that a person might say, I don't want to support a woman who wants to continue her pregnancy.
I'm saying that there may be people like that. That's not me. And I'll say that I come from a tradition much like David's. I grew up evangelical. I believe that Jesus taught that we are to care for the poor, the least privileged. We give a good percentage of our income away to such things. But on the other hand, I wonder, outside of that moral obligation that I feel as a Christian, what requirement is there of a pluralistic society to be expected to care for people financially when in other words, maybe if I weren't a Christian, I would say, listen, that wasn't my choice, so I don't feel any expectation to financially support that decision.
So what I hear you saying is, let's not dismiss or write off those who wouldn't support expansive social spending that basically they don't have any control over, other than electing representatives who do votes, and so that they might be happy to recognize a personal obligation to provide charitable support, but that the percentage of their paycheck that goes to that, they may feel that there's a limit, or they've reached it, or don't go over it, or it's too high already, or whatever. So I hear what you're saying. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah.
Well, I would say that, kind of make up your mind, which is, you can't both want to tell women that they can't have an abortion and then say, and there's nothing we can do for you to have a baby. So to me, I would say, which is more important? Is it, preventing abortion, or is it, fiscal, reining in fiscal spending? Because I do think that they're part and parcel of the same, one path, for each decision. I don't think that you can really expect women to, 75% of women who are having abortions have financial reasons. And so you are talking about a population that really is in need of support if they were to continue this pregnancy and care.
This problem is true about abortion, perhaps, but it's nothing what it does to pacifists who will have to give them money to have nuclear weapons.
$700 billion defense
budget. I don't know why
budget.
the Hyde Amendment has never been used by anybody else as a platform to say, well, I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to something I find reprehensible.
The idea has come up. The problem is the practicality and actually getting support for that in the Congress.
Yeah, I guess it's, you can do laser lighting medically where you can't do other places.
By the way, probably 20 years ago or more, a very good pro-choice political scientists did argue that if society really she raised the question, if society really took responsibility for the well-being of every child, would one of the implications of that be that society should have some say in how many children there are? Because society is now assuming a true, very substantial commitment to that child's welfare. And she phrased it as kind of a quandary or a thought experiment. I mean, we were so far from that at the time, and she knew it. But it was kind of, if we ever won this battle, would it, as a political scientist in her thinking, would society then have some claim on how women, some legitimate claim on how women exercise their reproductive rights? So you're not the only one. Her name was Roz Pacheski.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I think
So Jessica Aaron, Center for American Progress. Reverend Gushee, I want to thank you for your openness that you've modeled this weekend and sincerity. I really do appreciate that. And I also appreciate your comments earlier today about the possibility of movement in the among evangelicals on the issue of contraception. Mm-hmm. And my question is in regard to the, my initial question, I have another one now, but my initial question was in regard to the conservative coalition that was cobbled together starting in the 70s that we've already been discussing today, and how that coalition was also effective in preventing universal child care under President Nixon and getting President Nixon to veto a bill that did get through Congress for universal child care. Wow. And how that coalition has also, over the years, come together to block paid family medical leave, paid sick days, in large part, I think, because of traditional notions about the family and gender roles and this discomfort with women leaving the home and working outside of the home. And now women are half the workplace, and I think a lot of people's lives have changed because of that, and their attitudes have as well. And so maybe people are coming around to this idea of private-public partnerships and supporting families. And so I'm just curious about whether you see movement there as well. That was my first question. The next is, since the issue of public funding for abortion just came up, and it hasn't come up at all this weekend, I can't resist but asking, I recognize the arguments that the reason for that policy is because it might violate the taxpayer conscience to support something that they object to, even though we've established that we don't do that in any other area. But because it disproportionately falls upon the poor and becomes a burden for the poor, that adds increased stress and suffering to their lives. How do you reconcile that? So I'm sorry to put it all on you. I'm just very curious about these things, and maybe Sidney has some comments as
well. I would say that evangelical women have now entered the workforce at the same percentage as all other women, and I go to all these Christian colleges, and there are all these bright, young evangelical women students who I think it's changing the evangelical world dramatically, and is making the older kind of patriarchal patterns increasingly incomprehensible and unsustainable. And so I don't think that opposition that may have been based on the traditional role of women, I think that that's increasingly a thing of the past. It will, to the extent that that was a factor. The only place it can be sustained anymore is in the most conservative subpart of the evangelical church culture. I've written about this. It's basically a fallback position. We have to accept gender egalitarianism everywhere else, but maybe in our churches we'll just have men be pastors and feel like the world still has some order to it, Right, So in other words, I think some of that has changed and will continue to change. I don't personally. I see the dilemma that you're identifying related to public funding of abortion. the concept of tragedy strikes me again because of it's all bad. Every aspect of this is bad. It would be bad to have to support paying for abortions in that situation. From my perspective, it's bad that that the situations that these women are in are bad. The fact that 70% of the people who have abortions are poor it reflects social problems that are very deep. But I can't bring myself to support public funding of abortion. But you're right I think that carve out of that particular exception reflects a deep and broad social unease with the current state of the law, and I wish there were the same deep and broad social unease in some other areas, such as our constant war fighting and $700 billion a year for war and that kind of thing. Yeah, I have to go.
I think my watch is just a little bit fast, but maybe that would be an excellent last word to let the audience show their appreciation.
Yes. Y'all keep talking, all right? All right.
Yes. David was gracious enough to fill in on this panel on very short notice, and his playing arrangements were already set up. And I would say, since we started late, maybe you could take another 5 minutes if we have some additional questions. And I suspect the other group started late, and so I have a feeling if we end, we'll be waiting for them anyway. So 5 minutes. Yeah. Do we have? This has been such a lovely, orderly question process. I'm delighted.
I actually have, my name is Kelly Brunacini. I'm the Executive Director of Feminist Choosing Life of New York. And this is off the topic of adoption and federal funding of abortion. But I was thinking about ways to encourage women to continue their pregnancies. And as I go around to high schools and colleges, I'm often disturbed by the idea that young women have about motherhood and about pregnancy. So my question to you is, what role do you see the media portrayal of motherhood as influencing women to continue their pregnancies or to abort?
Well, I mean, there's very rarely any portrayal of a woman who chooses abortion in the media. I mean, I think it was Maud. Then I think recently, Dallas Friday Night Lights, which was just completely exceptional. But normally it's that she, considers it and then either miscarries, and so the decision's made for her, or she decides not to. And so, from a vantage point of the fact that the vast majority of, one in 3 women have had an abortion in the United States, the fact that it's not represented at all is, what we think is, contributes to the stigma and all that. So I don't think that there's any kind of media, push on terminating pregnancy.
What she didn't bring up too is the way that motherhood is
Right. So, I don't know. I mean, it seems like motherhood's so in flux, and it differs so very. I think in New York City it's really different to be a mom as it is in Nebraska, as it is, and so I'm only basing it on my television watching experience. I was what you're saying kind of made me think of something I was thinking when I was listening to him. I mean, I don't know if any of you watch Sister Wives. You watch this on TLC? It's this polygamous family, 3 wives.
My granddaughter's watching it and telling me, isn't it
It's totally fascinating. I keep thinking like my feminist brain's like short-circuiting because I'm like, this is a feminist, and it's like 2 of the women work and one's the stay-at-home mom, so it's like wives with wives, and it's like so it just feels to me like it's really malleable right now, and that. I mean, for me, one of the things that I don't think is discussed is how different fatherhood is today. I mean, motherhood seems to be on a we're constantly examining it, it's really under a microscope all the time, but fatherhood has happened on the periphery of all of these massive changes happen to women. And today we have, like, I think as a result of family planning and women in the workforce and educated women, the true family man who's suddenly more involved in his child's lives than any other generation of men before, won't go back, is more joy, finds more joy in fathering than their fathers did. And so for me, I think like we don't have enough of an emphasis on how satisfying and fulfilling fatherhood is. And how men have really been the beneficiaries of the women's movement. I think that there needs to be a little bit more recognition in the media of that reality that we see today.
Well, I think that you're just saying that the research is showing that altruism is innate in us, and that the sort of helper principle that women help and give, you get joy. I mean, you get joy. That's why people want children and why people aim to do that. But I also think that as far as the motherhood goes, there's usually just a very little window of who are mothers. All of these, that motherhood goes on and on and on and on and on. It is not usually shown in the media, which is all about news. And also the idea of the burdens and the fact that if you have children and stay home, that is somehow keeping you away from this other glamorous, wonderful life. So I think that's also a factor in which the burden is a sort of regression, and you're not really being a good feminist and all sometimes in that respect. So I don't think there's a very clear, accurate, realistic picture of either the rewards or the commitments or the maturity that is needed. So I think we need to think a lot more about what motherhood is really about. By the way, I never mentioned that I had 7 children. One of them in a charity clinic where I really saw how poor women were treated. Wow. It was a real experience in that sense. Also, we had 7 men in death. So that showed me that I am not in control of keeping anyone alive. So I think that these experiences of seeing how chance works in life, and how we take the chance and what we make of it, is a very important thing to remember too. So I really don't like the phrase unintended pregnancies very much, because it's unintended by whom? Does that mean that your pregnancy isn't really happening because it was not intended? So I think I like surprise pregnancy. Because a surprise can be very depressing or very wonderful. And I think we remember 2 times, 2 tears when these various things. The first, when I couldn't get pregnant. What do you mean? I'm ready now to be pregnant. It doesn't just happen automatically, a preview of the fertility bomb. Well, you seem to have gotten over that. And then again, thinking, I don't think I can really deal with one more, because, 7 and 10 years, all those sort of things. We were always poor. So I think that made me understand that if I have the ability, that emotions can be regulated and cultivated and changed. So one of my problems in this whole area is taking the immediate emotion as what is going to make the decision. And so I think this idea of really thinking it through is also important. What is my ideal? What kind of standard do I want to live? What kind of life do I want to have? So anyway, that's something I didn't get a chance to say.
So along these same lines, about fatherhood and the role of men. So it's in the example of France, and in a lot of the discussion around the policies that we need to support women, families, and safe pregnancy, if we are truly pro-life and want to support the life of children and the life of people in the world, in our country, we need to have universal health care and maternity leave and job protections and all kinds of things that we've identified. But so that always ends up with this seeming dichotomy that someone's going to be taking care of the kids, and it's either going to be women or the state. What hasn't yet been discussed is what if it should be men? What if we don't have to become, really in favor of a big government per se, and we can also be feminists if we say, yeah, the family should be taking care of the kids, not the state, but I just think that it should be dads and not me. Or, you could reconcile that with lots of state protections, of course, but it's just sort of a third approach that haven't seen really mainstreamed, because even in places like Sweden, where there's lots of protections for dads to parent, it's still not nearly up to the level of what we sort of require and also allow for women to be able to choose if they want to choose to be parents, while also working or if not working. So I'm wondering, what do you guys see as potential opportunities to put the parenting ability of men sort of in the cultural discourse and also at the policy level to allow men to parent and to protect them when they choose to be parents?
I just had lunch this past week with a friend who worked for the mayor in New York City and didn't have any paid maternity leave. And her husband, who works for an agency, like a nonprofit offshoot of the city, had paternity leave, and he took off time, and it was, for her, it was a really hostile environment. It was a really, she said her son had an earache, and it was like cataclysmic that she would need to go to the doctor with him and take time off that day from work, and so she left. And I think that is a microcosm of what we know when you see. I think that we have to kind of examine as a country what the work-family policies are and what the benefits are. I mean, there have been studies done that show that companies that have good work-family policies, including paternity leave and paid full of that they have much greater retention of employees, much greater commitment on behalf of the employees to do a good job. I mean, the cost-benefit analysis is just so off the charts. And so I think that we have to make a better way of bringing in the kind of business world into seeing that, there's not this antagonism that, people work and have lives. And that there needs to be some acknowledgement that those are not opposing ends of a productive workforce. So yeah, right now a lot of these decisions are made on income. And so if a woman is making more, which is increasingly, we had a man session, right? And most of the people who lost their jobs were men in the last year. And so I think that we're seeing these are very practical decisions. Why a woman would give up her job if she's making $20,000 more a year than her husband. Now we're going to increasingly see, I think, more men staying at home just as a pragmatic matter. So taking away this stigma and embarrassment that, I think we'll, in the next 20 years, then we'll see men kind of taking it on as a role. And all the surveys show that they want to. They want to stay home.
Yes, let's hold up men to a positive thing for once. I have 5 sons. I think, that these are wonderful daughters. I think that men have just as much nurturing, just as much emotional sensitivity. Always part of my feminist gender message was not only should we be equal, but we're more alike than we're ever different. And it's what is rewarded and what is practiced and cultivated in a society. And I have always been a person who did not think, I never was a difference feminist. I was always an equal equality feminist. And I think I've seen it around me, and I see that men are able to do these things and share. And I think that part of the idea that men and women are so different is one way to keep women back. And in a kind of funny, kind way, oh, you're so much better at this, so therefore you have to do it and stay home. So I think that,
Gloria Steinem has a quote where she says, we've discovered that women can do what men can do, and now it's time to see that men can do what women can do. And I think that men have been really shortchanged in the kind of life gift of parenting for the last, however many centuries. It's only now, recently, that they've been given the gift of being able to be a true father, and have that, you know, what we know motherhood, the greatness of motherhood being is now more similar, but it's true. I mean, my sons don't, I'm not the affection giver, and he's not the disciplinarian. Doesn't, you know, they come to whomever it is that they need that sometimes. It's equal.
It's also easier to be friends with people that are more like you.
Right, so it makes for a better marriage, right?
On that note of marriage advice, since we're getting